Hey everyone, welcome to a new video, welcome to my channel. My name is Maaike. Today's video is going to be all about my top 10 favorite classics of all time. Oh my. So this was, I don't know, this has been a video idea I've been playing around with for more than a year, and I just couldn't narrow it down, and I was like, you know what, Maaike? Just bite the bullet and do it. So in case you don't know, I'm an English teacher. I read English at university, so I've done some literary courses, you could say. However, a lot of it has been quite some time, but it also means that I have sort of also picked up some classics on my own beyond what I had to read for university. And there are certain books that, even though I sometimes even read them for university, I go back to, or I still have very fond memories of. So today I want to talk to you about my 10 favorite English literary classics. Some of them are like true classics, whereas others are more modern classics, you could say. There's a bit of a mixture here, and that has a couple of reasons. So let's just start with what could possibly be, I think, the book that most of you who watch this channel can see coming, and that would be this one. This is Dracula by Bram Stoker, and this is just, I don't know, this is a very beaten up copy, and even though I don't really go back to the original text all that much anymore, this is definitely a book that instigated a lot of my reading. I've read many other vampire related stories, not just Twilight, also other ones, don't worry, and I really like a good vampire novel, so why not go back? It's not the OG. There are definitely other vampire stories around. In fact, there's a book on my shelves that sort of goes into some of the other kind of texts that were written way before Dracula sometimes, and some of like the folklore that was behind it. But yeah, that's Dracula is like one of those like red lines running through my life, you could say. What you do need to know though, and that goes actually for a lot of the books on the list today, very often these classic stories, and in the case of Dracula, movies have been made on these books. And oh boy, not always for the better. And what I'm trying to sort of point out here is that if you are familiar with the story of Dracula only based on like popular culture, then you're very much in for a surprise when you start reading the original. It goes for some other books that I will be talking about today. This is going to be very boring and very tedious indeed. It's written through letters, first of all. So the story is sort of told for a very large chunk. It's like written as letters from one of the characters to another character, so that definitely makes for a very different kind of pacing than what we as modern readers are used to. And if you're expecting a very scary sort of vampire kind of story, to our standards today, this is not scary. So let me sort of start there and just point out that if you are looking for that sort of Dracula that we are familiarized with through it sort of starting to live its own life because of Hollywood, that's not what this is. Really go into it as blank as you can and just go like, okay, I'm going to read a story about a vampire. But even that, like, a lot of it is kind of hidden away, and it's not even that explicit until like the very end of the book. So I do have to warn you going into this that if you're like looking for this adventure tale of vampires and let me stake you through the heart, no, a lot of this is actually just boring accounting. So I'm really not selling it, am I? But yeah, Dracula by Bram Stoker is one of my OG favorites. It's a standard for a reason, and if you have read other vampire kind of stories, I mean, they seem to be coming back again a little bit. Definitely try and pick it up because it is a really good one, and I think in terms of storytelling, and if you know a little bit behind, like, of the background of this story and where it came from, then it becomes even more enjoyable. The more I find out about this book, its author, the time period it was written in, the more it really sort of fits within that narrative of like the time in which it was written. And that's what I enjoy a lot about this story. Another one that I think a lot of people know from popular culture, whether it is the BBC series with Benedict Cumberbatch or the Guy Ritchie movies with Robert Downing Jr., but Sherlock Holmes is definitely also another one of those classic lit characters that has started to go on off its own course, and where a lot of the things we have access to nowadays have nothing to do with the original stories. However, if you want to start reading classics, I think that something like the Sherlock Holmes stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle can be a really good place to start, because they do still kind of have that level of excitement that we're used to nowadays. I mean, this and also another author that I will be mentioning a little bit later are sort of like really like the first real well, they weren't the first detective novels, really, but in a way they were like the first times that these detectives really became very famous, and it sort of set off as this entire genre. Yeah, but again, don't expect the same kind of pacing and action-packed sort of approach that we have to stories nowadays. I don't have like a nice like collected stories of Sherlock Holmes. I have them all in like different editions. So these are the first two, the adventures and the memoirs, and then I have the other ones peppered around the rest of my bookcases. But yeah, this is also the kind of classics where you can just dip in and out of it, because each story is its own separate thing. And if you find reading classics quite tedious because the language can get quite wordy sometimes, then this is definitely a good place to start, because I think that way you can just, you know, read one story at the time, and that way get through it at one point in time. So yeah, this is definitely, I think, a good place to start if you want to get into classics. Another one of those, if you've seen the movie, it's not what you're going to be expecting, and it's Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I have heard so many people on BookTube vilifying this book. It's boring. Yes, this is not what you expect it to be if you only know the Hollywood version. In Hollywood, they've created this monster that is like tearing people apart. This story is nothing like that. In fact, the Frankenstein that we see in Mary Shelley is quite possibly the monster himself. I'm not giving away too much here. This is sort of like a discussion that's very much going on. In the original text, you will find that there's a very strong focus on nature, on morality, on the goodness of mankind. And that is, of course, something that we nowadays don't really read about a lot anymore. So if you're expecting this to be about a big, dark, looming monster that was created by the scientist Victor Frankenstein, that's not what's going on in here. Surely that creation story is there, but that let's just put it this way, it's just a very meandering, almost road trip kind of story, more so than anything else. And if you go, again, like Dracula, you need to go into this with an open mind. Don't expect something super fast-paced. It's not the biggest book in the world, but it can still be quite difficult to read because of the way it approaches the topic. That's just something you need to be aware of. But again, this is one I've read multiple times, and I still hold Frankenstein very dear to my heart. And then a book that's not for the faint of heart, even though, again, if you're familiar with the dramatization versions in Hollywood, then this may, again, not be what you're expecting. Even though I think these ones are quite well done, like they're not taken out of context and like putting a lot of emphasis on like the scary, gory details, because of course it's Pride and Prejudice. I mean, Mr. Darcy can only be so scary, right? But I think that, again, if you read the original, Pride and Prejudice is one of my favorite books of all time. But this took me aeons to read. This literally took me months. And that had to do with the language use. There is a reason why quite a lot of the classics I am recommending are from the 19th century, because I feel that that's when writing became more like what we are used to, whereas a classic like Pride and Prejudice It's very enjoyable, but if you know nothing of what society was like at the time, if you have no idea of the kind of diction people used, then this is going to be very difficult to get through. And especially if you're a non-native speaker like myself, this can be a difficult read. You really need to get used to the way the language is used and how everything works and just how everything is presented. Like, don't expect this to be like Bridgerton, please, or the Keira Knightley, Matthew McFadden / Colin Firth, and who the other person was. I don't remember, but if you're used to those kind of, like, again, dramatizations, this may put you off a little bit. However, this is one where if you just get stuck in it and this is the kind of book, like, I don't annotate my books at all, but this is one where I'm like, I want to go back to this at some point and just highlight all the lovely phrases that are in here, because Jane Austen's language is just miraculous. So I would want to go back to it for that reason. Something a bit more modern for a minute, and that would be Jack Kerouac's On the Road. This is a very well-read copy. I really got into a little bit of the Beat generation, sort of looking into that. I don't know, when I was fresh out of college, and this was the book I decided to pick up, and it's weird in some passages in here are just weird, and I like weird. So again, if this is not the kind of book that I think everybody will like. However, if you don't know what this book is about, because I think the other ones, you kind of know the premise if you've heard of them, but Jack Kerouac's On the Road is about a group of friends who are going on a road trip. And for the most part, some of these things actually happened because him and his friends, who were the other like beat writers of the day, are sort of in this story, and they actually did these road trips in like the 1940s, like second half of the 1940s. They actually went on road trips. Of course, how much of it is fictionalized, that's always up for debate, but I just really connected to this book in some reason when I read it, and it was just one of those things, like there's a lot of reference to music in here and like being different and sort of like trying to find your way in life. And I think at the moment I read this, that was something I was going through as well. So that's probably why it has I had such a strong connection to it. Again, go into it with a bit of an open mind. I believe isn't there also a movie version of this? There is a movie version of this too, which I would believe not. I didn't like it at all. So stick to the book, that's for sure, because I don't know. It's the way this book is written. Like, it refers to jazz and food and like all these things, and it's like the book itself to me really made it come alive. Like, you could smell the food and experience the music, and you could see the sweat dripping off the face of the musician who's like really into his saxophone. Like, it really goes in that sort of like level of descriptive detail. And I'm normally not someone who likes descriptive detail, but in this book it really made me like almost like I was in the back of the car with them. That's all I can say. Next up, another classic, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And I have to say, I read this and I was like, oh, I quite like this, but not for the love story. I just really like Jane as a character. I really like how strong-headed she is, and I really liked her. And I just didn't really care for the whole Mr. Rochester kind of love story kind of thing. It's got some darkness, some gloominess. I think that in terms of classics, this is perhaps one that's very easy to read for modern readers. It doesn't have such an archaic writing style, I find. I mean, it was written in the 19th century, so it's not going to be too up to date. But I think that this, in terms of like language use, is a lot easier to get into than some of the other stuff, especially because it is quite a straightforward narrative where we're just following Jane and her perspective, and you're not distracted by too many other things. So that's why Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte I think is very enjoyable. Yeah, I just really like Jane as a character. But I wouldn't, like, the same thing with Pride and Prejudice. I don't read that book for the romance in it. I really, really do not. I hate romance. I hate romance stories. I really, really do. But it depends on what you focus on when you're reading the book. And I feel that Jane as a character is really well-rounded. and that she just really comes alive for me. It's just that some of the choices she makes, I don't really get, but I don't have to understand everything about every single character to enjoy a book. So maybe that's me. And we're taking it a little bit further back in time. Mr. Shakespeare's Macbeth. I was thinking, is there anything older that I can put on here? And I was like, you know what? If I have to pick a favorite Shakespeare play, it would be Macbeth. Possibly because it is the one that I had to read first for my university course. That's probably part of it. I've also seen this performed at the Globe years ago now. So this is just a story that I have a lot of connotations by. And in terms of like gothicness and Shakespeare, this is perhaps the most gothic-y one of all of his plays. So yeah, I think Macbeth is the one that I would pick, that I enjoy the most in terms of, you know, Shakespeare plays. I haven't read all of them though, so that's a bit of a bold statement to make, but yeah, this is one that I really enjoy. One of my all-time favorite books, I was like, oh, I need to put that on the list, even though I think this book is not as well known as some of the others, but I think it's good to put something up here that's not as well known by everyone, and that's Willa Cather's The Song of the Lark. I had to read this for a master's course, and I fell completely in love with this story. Again, it does take quite some time to get through because it is a bit long-winding. In this story, we follow a girl called Thea Kronberg, and we follow her from infancy until she grows up and is an adult. So we take her entire lifespan, but it's one of the best coming-of-age stories I have ever read. And even though Thea, as a person, she knows what she wants, but she isn't always nice about it either. So I think that that's another reason why I quite enjoyed it. Very often, female characters in these like classic literature kind of books are just sort of like the demure, smiling girl, and Thea most definitely is not. So if you want to read a book written from a kick-ass perspective, or a kick-ass heroine's perspective, I should say, but that is set in a more historical time period because it was written at the time, then yeah, I think this is a really good one. I read this for a course that was about sort of how the frontier influenced the making of people, and people have written about it. So Willa Cather herself was from Arizona. This book takes place in Arizona, sort of like at the end of the 19th century, and sort of how growing up in this small, like, frontier town is influencing Thea's chances in life. That's sort of what this is about, and it's this giant exploration also of how her interactions with different parts of the community, how that influences them as well. So it's quite wide-sprung, you could say. But yeah, focuses on one main character, and yeah, you either love her or you hate her, but I thought she had spunk. Something a bit more modern, and again, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I was like going through my shelves and I was like, oh, but I really like The Great Gatsby. This is one that was on my high school reading list. This is like one of the very few books we had to read for English. And I remember being the only person in my class who enjoyed it at the time. And I reread it when the movie came out, and I liked it again. So this is one that I've read several times, and I don't know, it's just, I think it kind of fits into the line. Like, there's also a couple books that were written later in time that are also about these like rich people that just get away with things. And I don't know, that seems to be a trope that I kind of like. And this is a short one, and yeah, I don't know why, but I really enjoy this book. I have for most of my life, and I still do, so that's why it had to go into the list. And we're closing things off with the master of suspense, Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. So that's why I was earlier stating when we were talking about Sherlock Holmes that there were some detective novels in here, because Edgar Allan Poe is most definitely accredited with writing one of the first detective stories in English. And I just have one of his like selected story books here. So you can, this is again, like Sherlock Holmes, something you can dip in and out of, read some of his poetry, read some of his stories. Not all of it is dark necessarily with Edgar Allan Poe. There are some stories with gothic-y elements, but not all of them have that. And I think that Edgar Allan Poe is just a really good one again if you want to get into classics. This is a great place to start. So if you're a newbie and you've never read an English classic, Edgar Allan Poe, Jane Eyre, Sherlock Holmes. I think those three can still very much, there's just almost like a timeless factor to these books. I think that Edgar Allan Poe as well, I mean, if you're looking for like horror, like with Dracula, like with Frankenstein, in the sense that we're used to right now, it's not going to have the same effect as it probably had when these books were first released. But I think that Edgar Allan Poe still has quite a few stories actually that can still give you that like, ooh, eerie kind of feeling, you know? So I do really like Edgar Allan Poe's stories for that. And yeah, this is again an author where sometimes I just want to read something and then I don't know what, and I just dip in, read a story, and then I put the book away again. This is not the kind of book where you need to like go through it in one sitting, even though at some point I had to, because this was for a course. But yeah, Edgar Allan Poe is one of my favorite authors precisely for that reason. So yeah, that's my final recommendation. So those would be my top 10 favorite classic literature recommendations. I'm not sure if I made a lot of sense, but yeah, some of these are super duper famous. You can look up the premises online, I'm pretty sure, even if you don't know yet what these stories are about. But with a lot of these, if you know there are movies or other adaptations out there that you are already familiar with, please be very cautious with your expectations going into these books, because they may not be exactly what you think they might be. And I have seen so many people on BookTube discrediting stories because they are not what they had expected based on what popular culture has been feeding them. So if you can take them at face value, you're in for a ride for sure. So I hope you have fun reading. And then I would like to thank you very much for watching this video today. Please give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more by me. I make one video a week over on this channel. So I hope to see you in my next video. Bye-bye!